So,
Hey guys, it's Rudy. I've been wanting to cover this guy for a while. This guy named Dean Radin. He's a PhD and chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Science, an associated distinguished professor of integral and transpersonal psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Man, that's a mouthful. But interesting fellow. He basically studies psi phenomenon, psychic events, and an actual scientist. So he's not actually like a conspiracy nut or a truther or anything like that. He's just a regular dude. And as far as I know, from what I know about him, he wasn't raised Christian. He wasn't raised Catholic. He was I don't even really think he was raised an atheist. He was just raised to be a normal dude. And there's a particular part I wanted to cover, and it's around the 18-minute mark. There's two things I want to cover actually, and I'm gonna see if I can find the spot. We're gonna go on and watch it together. Universal consciousness. Let's just get into it.
That language has been translated, as you say, to multiple books, especially in the self-help category, like The Secret, Think and Grow Rich, The Alchemist. And they also mentioned visualizing, having already achieved the goal, believing that it already happened. What's the science behind these affirmations and these visualizations? And you also mentioned symbols, how symbols are important in creating goals, in trying to manifest what you want to happen.
so the symbols, the rituals, the dark hooded robes, the candles, all of that is theater essentially. But it's important because it helps focus the mind. So there are two ways of going about it. One is meditation, which is completely interior, although there are active forms of meditation. The other way is much more driven by the external world. So if you need a ritual, or you need a candle or a pendant or something to help focus your mind, well, that works too, because it's all about focus.
So what this man is basically talking about is these rituals people perform. Let's say, for instance, I've talked about it in a previous recording where my wife will take her bottle, when she has a bad feeling, she'll take her bottle of perfume and kind of spray it all over her shoulders or something along those lines. Dean Radin is basically saying it isn't so much the way these people are manifesting is through physical rituals. It's more about the action and the intent rather than the ritual itself.
How does it work? How would this happen from a scientific perspective? The answer is we don't know. So all we have at this point are speculation. So one speculation is that when you place a desire in the future, that the probabilities start moving in such a way that you will end up at that place. So you state the affirmation in the present tense, typically, although you think of it as, this is where I'm heading to that thing. So I've done experiments to see if we could test this idea, where you set a goal which, unknown to the person, actually is in the future. It's only about a second in the future, but nevertheless, the goal of the experiment is a future event. And what you find in these experiments is that that's what happens. People are able to achieve the event even though it's in the future. So to repeat, we don't have a solid scientific explanation of what's going on at this point, but it looks like it's a goal-directed or a teleological process. You draw yourself into the future you want to be in, as opposed to pushing yourself. See, it's like from two different directions of time. If you're already at the goal, you pull your past self towards yourself. And if you're in present time, you push yourself towards the goal that you wish to achieve. So interestingly, the idea of a symmetry in time is pretty well accepted in physics. I mean, all of the equations of classical and quantum mechanics are time symmetric. And in fact, many cases, time doesn't even come into play into the equations. So at least what we can say is that affirmations, if they're in fact goal-directed, are not violating what we know about the physical world. What we don't understand yet exactly is how does consciousness interact with all of this in order to make it happen. And so you have to take off your science hat and put on your esoteric history hat. And then we start talking about things like small c consciousness and big C consciousness. Those are not part of science yet, but that seems to be a viable explanation that's been around for 10,000 years.
So you mentioned, this got me thinking for a second, big C consciousness and little c consciousness. And I think a lot of people tend to think that it's the the frontal lobe part of the thinking, the frontal lobe thinking of the brain, it would be the C, the capital C part, but I think it's actually reversed. I'm not sure if he actually talks about this here, but it's, to me, and others have pointed out, that it's the frontal lobe thinking part of the human brain, or the whatever consciousness is the dumbed down part. It's the part that's been ruined by education and by society and all that. When it's your subconscious inner knowing part, that to me that would be the big C. I don't know what Dean Radin thinks is a big C and a little c. Maybe he'll get into it. Let's go and keep playing.
As opposed to science, which is about 300 years. So the time itself spent with these ideas doesn't mean one is better than the other, but we do have evidence that science is pretty good at what it does. Otherwise, things like this Zoom conference would not be possible. So I think
he makes a good point. The thinking part of the brain is very useful for solving problems that are practical problems. To me, the inner knowing, capital C consciousness, the part that ignores the frontal lobe thinking is it's more about spiritual decisions. And I think all of our lives we've been trained to snuff that part out.
so. The time itself spent with these ideas doesn't mean one is better than the other. But we do have evidence that science is pretty good at what it does. Otherwise, things like this Zoom conference would not be possible. So I think science will eventually catch up to ancient ideas, and we'll have different language and different ways of thinking about it at those terms, with new terms. But nevertheless, we'll find that many of these esoteric ideas are in fact correct.
I don't think, Dean Radin is an optimist in that way. But unless there's more Dean Radins in the world that are into this kind of thing, I don't see that happening. I have to disagree with him almost 1,000%, because you and I both know the creeps don't want people to wake up or realize that they have these extra phenomenal abilities, mental abilities. They do not want manifestors to realize that they're manifestors, that they can manifest. That's the bottom line to me. These creeps do not want that. So Dean Radin may be an outlier, and in my opinion, he's being used by the system in that way. It's because there has to be somebody like Dean Radin for everyone to point at, to the skeptics, right? So, quote unquote, NBC skeptics, to point at Dean Radin and go, look at this lunatic.
And saying that science is gonna catch up, I feel like the world is catching up. Well, not catching up because it's been here for so long, but this self-help books, people like Tony Robbins, Joe Dispenza,
they're all shills of the system. Tony Robbins, Dispenza. I used to listen. I never listened to Tony Robbins, but I used to listen to what was his name again?
To question these people like Tony Robbins, Joe Dispenza.
Joe Dispenza, that's it. I used to listen to him, and he's just out to sell his books. His message may be correct, but his intentions are...
The validity of medicine and scientific statements, you could say, and people are more open to new ideas, to ideas from esoteric backgrounds. And I feel that science has to catch up to the inner world, as you've said before.
Right. I think it's important to say that while it's important to always question everything, I mean, science is all about skepticism, really. What we have learned in science is valid, right? We don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. But what we do want to do is to prevent science from collapsing into a kind of dogma. And the dog, it's very easy to do that.
It's a
You start
little late
getting
for
a
that,
sense
in my
of we know
opinion.
exactly how things work, and then anything that comes along that challenges that is simply dismissed. Say that's impossible. Well, that's no longer science. That becomes science as a kind of religion. And so part of the goal then of what I think should be taught as a scientific career, first of all, is humility. We don't really know that much about the nature of everything. We've learned a lot of very interesting things. We have great instruments that allow us to test things. And we don't want to throw away what works, but we do want to expand it. And the history of science is all about this. It's all about evolving our ideas about how things work. And every time a new instrument is developed, it's like whole new realms of reality just open up.
I don't know about that sometimes. I mean, it's easy to say that good people had good intentions when it came to science, but it was usually out of a necessity or a need to improve, well, to basically improve your quality of life, right, of the normal person, supposedly. But even though it was usually, from what the story goes, right, what history tells us is that it was kings and queens who funded this so-called science, and was usually, and the science itself was usually brought forth by the churches. The original scientists were, religious people.
Before the microscope, we had no idea what was going on at the microscopic level. Before the telescope, we didn't have any idea about that. Every new instrument gives us a new window to reality, and it expands our sense of what we thought was possible. A great example is quantum mechanics. The shift from classical to quantum mechanics only now, because it's being taught to younger and younger people, for many years, for probably the first 50 at least years of quantum mechanics being around, not only did few people know what it meant, but even fewer people had any idea of what it was about to do to our sense of what physical reality is like. So it has radically changed. So when I hear people today saying, well, things like psychic phenomena can't be true because they violate the laws of physics, what I immediately think of is they're thinking of Newton. They're thinking of 17th century physics, not what is currently available now. And so if you look at just that change, that took a long time to happen, but science is rapidly proceeding in many different dimensions. For someone to say now that this violates the laws of physics tells me that they don't know what the laws of physics are.
I'm going to move on to the next clip, around the 20-minute mark, where he talks about, I'll just let him speak for it.
Photons, when we
It'd be
observe
the
it.
easiest way to handle it.
Here's the instrument that we use. This is called a Michelson interferometer. And the way it works is you have a laser beam coming in from the left. It's a half-silvered mirror. Part goes through, part gets bounced. They bounce off the mirrors, they go back together, and it creates an interference pattern. So it's just like a double slit system, except it's configured in a slightly different way. And we ask people, put your mind in that arm of the interferometer. If that does something, you're basically observing the photons as they go past, it should change the way that the interference pattern goes. That's the idea. So we put all of this when we had our laboratory in the building next door in the basement, where Garrett's lab is now. We put the interferometer in the lab. We asked people like meditators to cast their mind into the shielded room in that particular spot where we asked them to go and simply observe mentally the beam. There's the task. Showed him where to put his mind, but he's outside the box now. He can't see it, he's only able to think about it. And this, by the way, is Swami Veda. So there's it's all the equipment's inside our shielded room. What does it look like? So the camera that's looking at the interference pattern is actually able to get a two-dimensional picture of the pattern itself. So this is a color-enhanced version, and you can see it has a ripple-y shape to it. This is interference that it's seeking. And then we plug one of the holes, and you can see that when it only has one slit, then you get a diffraction pattern, like a flat pattern. So if you take a cross-section of those, with two slits, you get this ripply pattern. One slit, you get a flat pattern. We'll look at the difference between the two, and this is what we're hoping to find. This difference will be what happens when you observe versus don't observe. That's the prediction. The protocol is very simple. The compare what happens with the interference pattern in the two conditions. And it's also simple in that you ask somebody to put your mind for 20 seconds in that place in that other room that I showed you and leave it there. Look at photons in your mind's eye. And then when you're told, take your mind out, rest for 20 seconds, and then we'll do it again. We'll do this back and forth a bunch of times. So this is what you get. There's no observation taking place. You get a pretty much flat line, meaning there's no difference in what's going on in the interferometer. If you ask somebody to do this with their mind, put their mind in the box, you get this upside down ripply wave, which is what we had predicted to see. Not everybody was able to do this. This was produced by Swami Veda, who was a head of a Himalayan tradition, a meditation society, and at the time had been meditating for probably 60 or 70 years, and in particular was adept at the siddhis, the special abilities that you get through advanced meditation. So I asked Swami Veda, how did you do that? And all he would do was smile. And so I said, well, did you send your mind into the room over there? And he said, no, it's all inside here. He's pointing to his heart. The world is inside there. Look at the results of all of the people we did. We ran 18 people. Some were non-meditators, some were meditators. All of the action was in the meditators.
So what the Swami basically said was, reality is inside me. He is the manifester. Therefore, he controls the reality. And maybe to a really, really small extent, enough to make Dean Radin's little machine go off. I'm not going to pretend to understand the logistics of it or the technicality of it. All I can go by is what Dean Radin is presenting, right? But it speaks to my inner knowing when the Swami, whatever his name is, says it's almost as if the machine's in him or whatever. It's like, yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. Reality is inside you. You manifest. You're the manifester, right? That's basically what he's saying. Next thing I want to show real quick is this is another one of Dean Radin's presentations. This is a clip from a slideshow that he was doing, and what you're basically looking at is the signals from two brains, which shows the sender and the receiver. Right here, sender, receiver. And I think it's I think the way he explained it, it's two people that actually know each other like intimately, like a husband and wife or boyfriend and girlfriend who've been with each other for a very long time. And he would set up experiments where the sender would be asked to send a mental image, or think about the other person, to think about the receiver for a specific period of time. And then a light would flash. I'm gonna have to find the presentation because I can't remember exactly how this went. Yeah, let's do that. Let's pause.
How science is developed. It's called reductive materialism, and it works like this. Physics is at the bottom, and then chemistry, biology, and psychology. Somewhere near the top, you have awareness arising out
Sorry
of
about
the
the coughing, guys.
That's
I'm gonna edit that
reductive
out.
materialism. It's based on a model of emergence. Like, we know that there are electrons everywhere, including inside your head, and your brain, and everywhere else. But things emerge out of that, and it becomes more complex at these higher levels of organization. Also, causation then moves from physics upwards. This is one of the reasons why physics is considered to be the foundational science, and why they get more money than most.
You know what's funny about this chart is that it's upside down, or at least, at the very least, awareness needs to be at the bottom. Because to me, it seems that the metaphysics, the inner knowing, the awareness, is what is at the bottom. Like, it's the foundation of everything else. I think it's really ironic that this pyramid is the way it is.
To the other areas. So that's what people believe. That's what they're taught. That's what most students, after a while, will.
Made a good point. That's what we're taught.
It's so inculcated into students that when you get out, like from a doctoral program, you have no reason to not believe this. So anyone telling you anything else is
You're a lunatic.
Well,
Here we
the
go.
story has
Quantum.
already begun to crack a little bit because quantum mechanics is somewhere near the bottom of physics.
See, he's implying that, and I forget what else he says. He might change his presentation as it goes on is going to change. But to me, awareness is still at the bottom.
And quantum mechanics is extremely unlike almost everything else in this thing because it's no longer in space-time. It's not even a thing anymore. It's relationships. It's weird stuff. That's why weirdness mechanics is talked about a lot. So there's already a crack beginning at the bottom. Nevertheless, most scientists and throughout their career deal with their own discipline and with interactions between disciplines. So most people in biology don't know all that much about physics, and vice versa. People in psychology don't know much about it either. What we begin to see, though, is it took 100 years. Finally, you're beginning to see you have quantum physics, you have quantum chemistry now, quantum biology, quantum psychology, usually called quantum cognition.
Quantum awareness?
And so it's not too much of a stretch to imagine that it goes all the way to the top. So there's some kind of quantum awareness.
And again, awareness needs to be at the bottom because to me, that's just the foundation of reality itself.
That is true. Then suddenly all the things psychic and interactions that we've been talking about here are not so strange after all, because the quantum world, the strangeness of quantum world is that things are connected through space and time. So that's one possible way this can go. The other way, which I think is probably better,
Oh, here we go.
is consciousness is fundamental.
He actually gets into it.
So here we're talking
Oh, he does
about
flip it. This might be
words
where I
like
got the idea
idealism,
from.
or Vedanta, or psychism, or neutral monism. It's all having to do with the notion that really what's going on in the subquantum realm, which is prior to space-time, that's a new case that we should be sitting all of our assumptions upon. When we do that, we might use
I
terms
was
like
wrong.
Bohm. David Bohm, the physicist, came up with this notion.
He didn't put
Implicate
awareness in the
order
bottom.
from
He
which
should, though.
the explicate
Come
order
on, man.
arises. So this
He's
is
5
an
years
order
old.
which Bohm and others had said is intrinsically mental.
I'll put a link to
It's a
these
mental
videos at the
space.
bottom
It's
in the description,
non-physical.
guys. That way you can read it
It's
without my
objective.
rambling. Or listen to it without my
So
rambling and
rather
getting in the
than
way.
using the word emergence, I would use the word precipitation, because it's a little bit like saying that there is some kind of a strange substance here, which is not like the physical world, from which things precipitate. Very much like when you look up at the sky and it looks perfectly fine, you can have hailstones coming at it. Well, it precipitated out of the medium itself. So this is
That's a weird
suggesting that
metaphor.
physics and chemistry and everything else precipitate out of this underlying medium. In addition, it means that we need to pull awareness down from the top of the pyramid and put it at the base. So you could use words like consciousness if you wish, or other words that have to do with mental construct. And the reason why that's useful is because just like electrons permeate everything above, now we have awareness permeating everything above. This is awareness that's before
Oh, he does put
physics.
awareness at the bottom.
Goes
I
before
glanced
space.
away for a second.
So suddenly, all of the strange things about
Nice.
psychic phenomena and other things I'll mention begin to make sense, because it means that your subjective life is made of this stuff. That's where the awareness comes from, and that's before space-time. So the fact that you can have a connection with somebody at a distance doesn't do any violence to any of that. It simply says we're living in a slightly different world, which is sitting on a different assumption. And this is important because one of the fears that you find in mainstream science for people who spent their entire career talking about physics or biology or whatever, they're afraid that somebody's going to come along like Wegener and tell them, no, that's not the way it works, and they're going to have to throw away their entire career. Nobody wants to do that, and they don't need to, because within each slice here, each discipline, it's all correct. We can change over time. It's all.
He made another presentation that's separate from this one where he talks about that exact topic, where if you come at anybody, if you're a scientist, right, you get labeled a crackpot basically instantly. Your career's over. But he has the privilege of doing what he does and being in this very specific realm of studying what he does. So he's in a perfect position to be talking about these things, but he still gets a lot of detractors, unfortunately. Because people just can't let go. They think physics is the foundation. The physical, the matter, right? The mother is the physical. It's the Oedipus complex. It's just a obsession with stuff, material, mother. It's all the same shit. They can't put their own awareness at the foundation because they're addicted to the material. To me, that's what that means. It runs deep. It's super deep.
Do, but it's not wildly incorrect. It just needs a new base.
It's so funny that
Again,
awareness was at
people
the
work
top and then it's at the bottom.
Bounds between, and ions we tend to work between here and those other ones on the top.
I hadn't watched this in like
where
3
our
months,
notion
so
that
this is why
consciousness is fundamental
I'm
in
kind of
some
foggy
way.
in this.
How do we then integrate it with the rest of the science? So you see more and more people beginning to write books on this. This one's by Stuart Kaufman, who came to visit us a couple of months ago.
That's enough of that.
If all of the preceding was true, then it probably is also true that there should be correlations between people's brains who are isolated. And so you can do an experiment of the following type. You take two people, you isolate them, you have them think about each other, you get some sort of a light flashing stimulus to create evoked potentials in one person's brain, and you look in the other person's brain and see whether you get an effect. Very simple. So here's how we did it up at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. We have our fancy shielded room. We put the receiver in there and measured a single cortical measure at CZ. The sender is at a distance. The sender's room is normally dark, but for the purposes of taking a picture, it has a flash here. So she's in a dark room looking at a blank screen, and every so often, the face of the other person pops up for a few seconds, and then it goes away. So that does two things. It does a visual stimulus. It creates a light flash, which will create an evoked potential in her brain. And it also reminds her what the nature of the task is, namely, you're trying to connect to your friend at a distance. So the experimental data looks like this. This is based on 13 couples. The sender's brain gets a big evoked response just about at the right time scale that you'd expect. And the receiver's brain also showed a peak at that point. If you do a correlation and do the proper statistics, you end up with a statistically significant correlation in time between the two brains. Now the sender's brain, of course, is completely expected. The receiver's brain is not, because the receiver is sitting in a dark room and nothing's happening. And by the way, the receiver never reports anything either. In this case, the receiver's not reporting seeing weird flickering lights or anything. She reports nothing. Well, this was published, another study was published by some colleagues at the University of Edinburgh where they looked at overall level of activation in the brain using a topological map. And you can see here that when the light flashed, let's see if it points it, yeah. So the light flashes here, roughly 200 milliseconds later, there's a lot of activity in the brain and sort of dies away. What's happening in the composite brain of the receivers? As it turns out, there's an interesting activation that rises in the receivers, which peaks around 200 milliseconds as well. Again, the receivers don't report anything here. This is all unconscious, but nevertheless...
I noticed this before, actually. Like 100 milliseconds before the receiver has some activity. I don't know if that's just something else going on or whatever, but it's no coincidence to me that the activity tends to get as the moment of stimulation for the sender's brain just syncs up completely.
Their central nervous system
I'm no scientist, guys. You just think of it what you will.
is running in time sync, apparently, with what's going on in the senders. And, yeah, the senders. There are lots of other studies of this type I could talk about, but I'm going to skip over them and go directly into the other fMRI studies. So here's a study done by Leanna Standish and her colleagues up at Bastyr University and Washington University. They did a study involving 30 couples who had been selected for meditation. This is when two people meditate with each other and on each other. So they'd been practicing this for a long time. They took those 30 couples, ran an EEG study, and selected the 3 top couples who seemed to show an EEG conduction, and then ran the top one of them in this study, in the fMRI. So this is one couple pre-selected out of a group of 30 people. And what you see here is in the receiver's brain, while the sender at a distance is looking at a flickering checkerboard pattern, that the occipital lobe, and in particular the visual cortex of the receiver, lit up in time sync and to a highly significant degree. So that was published in 2001. As far as I can tell, it was never reported anywhere other than in the journal. Like no science media picked it up. This was repeated a few years later with the same couple. Richards is at the University of Washington, again, the same couple, this time in both of the pair.
They would run the pair, first one as receiver, one as a sender, and then flip them. In this case, both of them showed an effect. One person with 30 trials ended up with a statistically significant difference, suggesting that somehow they knew what was about to occur. Starting in 1995, I guess, I started running a series of studies. This was one I ran here in Silicon Valley when I was working at Interval Research. This is the button press. Here's where the stimulus occurs. There's the presentiment difference, which turned out to be highly statistically significant. And most of the participants in this test turned out to be people like you, because I was working in an environment very much like this, and I needed subjects. And I basically would walk around and say, oh, you have 20 minutes to spare, and found people to do the test. So overall, I did 133 people, about 4,500 trials, and got a statistically significant effect along the line suggesting that there's something that is giving you a cue about what's coming up. So what sort of explanations can we use for this, other than precognition? Well, it is a long laundry list. As in any experiment of this type, we always go through alternative explanations that are more conventional. And so you go through all of these, and it turns out that none of them are very plausible, partially because of the way we designed it, also because of the way we analyze it, and even more explanations. The bottom line always is it independently replicable? And the answer is yes. Shortly after I presented my first study, Dick Bierman at the University of Amsterdam did an almost identical study using his hardware and his people, of course, and he reported basically the same kind of result that I did. He didn't actually think it was going to work, but did it. Here's how you do the experiment. You sit somebody down in front of a blank screen, and you record some measure. I typically have used autonomic measures, but as you'll see, you could use other measures as well. Skin conductance is a good one. They press a button. 3 to 5 seconds goes by while the screen remains blank. The computer randomly selects one picture out of a huge pool of pictures. And the computer just shows the picture for 3 seconds. It's either calm or it's emotional. And then the screen goes blank for a while to let the person calm down. And then you repeat this 30 or 40 times. So the whole experiment is over in 20 minutes. The pictures that I've used most often are called the International Affective Picture System. These were developed for the NIMH at the University of Florida, and there's an international standard of pictures that evoke emotion and to what degree they evoke the emotion. So examples are this. This is a low affect picture, non-emotional picture. This is a positive valence, high emotion picture for certain people, and the same for certain other people. And then there's also a negative valence, positive or emotional. And in each category here, they go to extremes. So in the really extreme case of a negative emotional picture, these are pictures you really don't want to see. And when they get in your head, and you sort of wish you hadn't seen them. It's that kind of a picture. Not so much on the erotic side. On the erotic side, you look at the pictures and you really want to see them again and again. That's a different story. So here's what the actual data looks like. This is skin conductance in somebody who saw a sequence of calm pictures randomly selected. So they might see a picture like that and a picture like that. And as you see, there's a certain degree of anticipation, waiting for the picture, you see it, and then they relax. And this happens again and again. But this is a real case where an emotional picture arose. And the presentiment then is this anomaly, that there is a greater degree of anticipation before that one picture than there was before the preceding pictures. So when you do this as a formal experiment, you end up with something like this. This is the average of all of the emotional pictures before, during, and after it was shown. And for the calm pictures, here's where you press the button to begin the trial. Here's where the stimulus is randomly selected. So when you press the button and your weight and your physiology is being recorded, the stimulus has not been selected yet. It's still in the future. That difference is a presentiment difference. It suggests that there's something about the future which is pulling your present. And so you can do a statistical analysis. In this case, one person with 30 trials ended up with a statistically significant difference, suggesting that somehow they knew what was about to occur. Starting in 1995, I guess, I started running a series of studies.
So what does this mean? What it means to me is exactly what I've been talking about. And what I've been talking about may or may not have a lot to do with these presentations. I don't know how much like I saw these presentations a few months ago, so I don't know to what degree these affected my opinion on things. Probably to a large extent. But to me, this means, and Dean Radin said it himself, he used people like me, people like you, to do these experiments. So these aren't swamis or, you know, people from the Far East who have been meditating for 20 years. It's just people like me and you who are making these wacky predictions. Which just goes to show that we're all capable of this. We all manifest reality. And it isn't a matter of fact about past or present. He said it, Dean said it himself, where he's like, they're anticipating something about the future. And to me, it's all one and the same. There's only the present. So either the person who's being experimented on is affecting the test itself, or I guess you can say perhaps a person is capable of affecting the result just from the mere fact that they're in a experiment situation. And I don't know if it's an act of action-reaction. Like if it's a retrocausal thing. I've talked about it before, where given my example where I glance up at the TV and I see a cat with multiple tails, which look like arms from what I experienced in just previously. To me, it's that. These experiments and these anomalies that Dean Radin is presenting are retrocausal. These are the retrocausal correction codes. A Mandela effect. It's almost like the reality script has to rewrite itself in order to compensate for the sudden manifestation. And it's also, to me, I've talked about it before, where the Black Mirror itself is protesting, right? It's wanting to wake people up, to show them that reality is much more than it seems. And I needed to show one more thing. I don't know if I'll be able to find it. If this video is about law of attraction. I think this is what I'm looking for. We're about to see.
In the present, you can imagine that any form of illness will travel a certain probabilistic path in the future. It'll get worse, it'll get better. It's a whole range of probabilities. What this suggests is that if you were to do a strong intentional prayer for somebody backwards in time to when they first became ill, could you help them move into a probabilistic future where they got better quicker than if they were not prayed for? And the answer is yes. And so there are experiments that are kind of like that, and they suggest the answer is yes. They're called completely outrageous, both by the people who do the experiments and of course by anybody who's reading the experiments, because it sounds crazy. And yet we know even from these laboratory studies that something like that seems to be possible. That whatever intention is doing it does not seem to be locked into ordinary space-time, just like any other psychic phenomena. It's somehow outside of space-time.
Amazing. Great. We've got several questions on how does this work from Ed, from Evan, from a few others who are asking, what's your best guess regarding the underlying physical or non-physical mechanisms of these anomalous effects? So maybe you could speak a little bit to that.
Okay, so let me go back to my slides because I figured somebody was going to ask that. Okay, so how does all this work? Well, the truth is that nobody knows how it works, but I have a guess as to how it works. In order to understand how anything works, we're talking about the worldview that you're looking at. So we're talking about the scientific worldview. What is that? It's materialism. So these are some of the phrases that are used in talking about these sort of things. You are a machine made of meat. Your sense of self is an illusion generated by your brain. These are standard neuroscience. And it comes about because the scientific worldview is essentially this. It's a hierarchy of different disciplines where physics is assumed to be at the bottom. Matter and energy is...
All right, I want to show something else real quick. This video is more of presentation of his is more about, this is really more about manifestation and intention.
But not caring
Let's go ahead
about
and play
it. Also,
Right.
that's a paradox. This is the so-called effortless striving.
And not going to that fear or that doubt.
Yeah, well, you can have it, but by doing lots of repetition and recognizing that, you know, you don't need it instantly, it allows it to unfold. And there are magical methods that people use to help your intention. So I used the example of a gold-plated Mercedes, and I said, you know, it could happen, but you also have to be extremely clear about exactly what it is that you want. So one day in the mail, I get this.
Oh, that's so cute.
So this is a Mercedes, it's gold-plated, and there, now I have it. Well, it was my friend, the practicing witch, who sent it to me as a way of reminding me that I didn't say that I wanted one I can get into and actually drive around. So I did get a gold-plated Mercedes.
And I know he's presenting this as a bit of a joke, but to me, it's 100% serious. And I wouldn't dabble in this form of manifestation, to be honest. If you're gonna pray for things, just pray for stillness. That's what I do. Do not pray for material objects because you don't know what's gonna happen. It's just something I do not dabble in. I'm not gonna lie, I have dabbled in it before. I've had 1 or 2 experiences. Well, I'm gonna say at least one. I've had one very specific experience where I wanted to manifest something. It happened, and I took it for what it was, and I'm never doing it again. Let's just put it that way.
And totally unknown to me that she even had this in mind. But it's a good reminder that part of the notion of doing an affirmation that is effective is to be absolutely crystal clear on exactly what it is that you want. And that makes the probability higher. It is not easy to push the universe around. We can push smaller things around. We have, in a sense, micro free will to do what we wish.
And he says we have micro free will. I thought that was kind of funny. But it's not easy to push the universe around, but it's easier to push whatever he said on the smaller scale. And I wonder to the degree the creeps are attempting to use real generator beings to manifest on a very large scale, a universal scale. Space travel, for instance, landing on the moon, etc.
It's unlikely that I could use affirmation all day long for my entire life and probably not change the orbit of Pluto, at least to a way that we can measure it, because it's too big. Even Harry Potter may not be able to do that. I mean, and that's fictional magic.
But like I said, he's not taking into account of multiple millions, billions of manifesting beings doing this. I think that's what the space program's about.
But for smaller things that, especially that don't impinge on others, on other people too much, or at all, those are, I would say, easier or more likely. Now I'm thinking maybe it should have a follow-up book on practical magic, because some people don't really care about the underlying science or the philosophy or the history of it, even though it's all important. They just want to know, what do I do? Like,
Yes.
how can I do this? So in one chapter in the book, I give some methods, but there's of course a million different ways that people can approach this. The part that people don't want to hear is that talent also plays a role. And sorry, if you're born in the wrong place or by the wrong parents or something, then you may not have that. This doesn't mean that if somebody wanted to play tennis, almost anybody can learn the rules and almost everybody can play it to one degree or another. Not many will become champions, but that doesn't mean that you can't do it. So I think that every sentient creature, to some extent, and humans, including, not all humans are sentient, I think, but of those who are, can you manipulate the world using magical methods? The answer is yes. The degree to which you can do that is going to be different from one person to the other, and also whether you meditate or if you take the right kind of psychedelics or whatever. So the potential is there.
Super interesting. Get off this lady's frame face. Super interesting, because I've talked about it before, where my wife, for instance, is probably a few or actually many degrees higher than me when it comes to manifestation, because too many weird things happen around us where it's really hard to just brush it off as coincidence. And he's absolutely right. I don't think I've seen this interview in particular before, because this was actually posted this year. September 24th happens to be my wife's birthday. To me, that was a clue to just go ahead and watch the whole thing and not record it. And then I got to this part, it's like I gotta record this part. And it's like, yeah, he nails it. Because I've had this, I'm wondering if I've had that intimation as well, where everybody, to a large degree or a smaller degree, if they're sentient, like he said, he doesn't even know if all humans are sentient. I don't know if he was saying that just to be funny, but yeah, I think he has a point. I think he's alluding to NPC types or people that may be asleep. But to me, even the people who are asleep are Pinocchios, right? But they have potential. Like they're manifesting in ways that they can't even begin to fathom, and they'll just brush things off as a coincidence. You know, those kind of people. But they're creating the reality around them unknowingly.
Right kind of psychedelics or whatever. So the potential is there for anybody who can do anything.
Well, that offers a lot of faith and hope for all of us. I just have to ask you one more question, and you did talk about this during our interview, but what are some of the tips in simple terms for creating magic, for real magic?
Well, one of the methods, time-honored method, is called writing magic. So a lot of people will write in a diary or a journal about what happened during the day, or maybe their thoughts and wishes and so on. Writing magic is not that different from that.
To me, that's spellcraft. That's casting spells with your words. You're writing symbols on a piece of paper and spelling. That's where the word spelling comes from. It's a ritual.
You write down what you want, presuming in most cases we want something to happen. It's you're wishing for health for you or for somebody else, or you want money or whatever it happens to be. You write that down, and then you make sure that it's clear. Like the thing that you're asking for is very, very clear, very precisely what you want. And you keep refining it down until it's a like one sentence, extremely clear thing that you want. And then you may write it down a few hundred times.
I'm not into this, by the way. I wouldn't recommend that.
To kind of cement it, you kind of get it in your head.
But do it if you want, and see what happens. I'm not really trying to discourage you. In my opinion, if you're not convinced about manifestation, it's a good way to have an affirmation.
And then you set that aside, but you don't want to dwell on it too much. It sort of needs to sink into your unconscious. And then maybe once a week, you go back and look at that and you do it again. Write it down again 100 times. And set it aside. And keep doing that until something is beginning to show that worked, whatever it happens to be. So the simpler it is, the more likely it's going to happen, and also the more likely it'll happen sooner rather than later. There's no guarantee in any of it, because as I said with the example of my gold-plated Mercedes, this one does not change the world very much. Because there's lots of these out there, and you can buy it. To have an actual gold-plated Mercedes, of which there probably are very few in the world, show up that is now mine, means all kinds of things had to happen out there in the world for them to make that happen. It's not going to go poof. Things need to happen in order for that to show up. So simple, clear affirmations are much more likely to happen sooner rather than later. But that doesn't mean you could write something.
I think we get the point of this, guys. I'm going to move on. All right, probably last section for this, what I'm talking about this fellow Dean Radin, where he talks about his personal synchronicities. Let's just watch.
Is necessary but difficult. So I have a story in Real Magic, which was very much like this. This is the story where we had an office and we had to move it somewhere, so we moved it to this other place. And we eventually found out, to make a long story short, that right next to us, there was another group doing psychic research. So the way I discovered this was I kept walking past that door and looking for somebody inside because I was just going to introduce myself, because on their door it said PsyQuest Labs. But we were doing cyber search and their name was PsyQuest, thinking, well, that's a funny coincidence. So eventually I see somebody in there, I knock on the door, the guy comes over, he opens the door and he looks like he's going to have a heart attack. He's really shocked. And later I learned that the reason is that he had been spending the whole previous day, 24 hours, doing a Tibetan dream yoga exercise, where you're awake for 3 hours and then you sleep for 3 hours, always holding the intention of what you want to manifest. And the reason you do this strange alternation is to get into the state that you're kind of mentioning here, where you're a little bit nutty. You can't clearly tell the difference between a dream and reality. Well, his intention was for me to show up. He had no idea where I was. He knew me from my books, but he wanted me literally to show up. So I knock on the door, he opens the door, and there I am. So that's why he was really shocked. And when he told me what he had been doing, we were both shocked, because I thought it had free will. I was just going there. But he called me in some way, or we called each other in some strange way. And so he manifested me as he wished, and I manifested the laboratory that he had, which is what I wanted, right next to each other.
Yeah.
So it's true that I wasn't in any particular altered state, but he definitely was. So we both were freaked out for a while.
So maybe if you're on the same vibration, if you will, it's like a magnetism. The two of you were in the two dimensions were colliding, or whatever is happening, and you attracted each other. It served each other's
I used the metaphor of a gravitational pull.
Yeah.
Right. So that when you have a desire for something, you almost imagine that you're in a planetary system and things are revolving around you. That pull begins to change the shape. It distorts the shape of the probabilities around you. And if it just so happens that somebody else has a similar pull, you will begin to rotate around each other and eventually collide. So the collision, I think in many cases, is what happens when people have a synchronicity that involves two or more people, which happens. You're like, one time we were in the middle of nowhere in Australia and ran into somebody that we knew. We had no idea they're going to be there, but what are you doing here? Well, that's a little bit like that things get pulled together and becomes meaningful.
Yeah. I like how you talk about.
All right, guys, I think that's it for my little presentation. I didn't talk a lot through it because I think what's happening on screen really speaks for itself. I think it's really funny that at the end, I think it's really funny towards the end there when Dr. Radin mentions that, like, do I even have free will? And it's like, and I'm sitting here shaking my head like, no, you don't. Nobody has free will. There's no such thing as free will. There's only, the best way I can put it, there's only the fractal, and there's only the dark mirror, the black mirror, the reality itself. But it's almost like, I don't know, it's strange. I'll have to really ponder this and think about it for a little while, because a lot of things get thrown into question when I gave my Black Mirror presentation, my Black Mirror reality presentation, and the topic of free will, because I had heavy implications that the Black Mirror reality somehow needs us to help manifest, at least manifest the reality itself. I think that's it, guys. Thank you so much for your time. Have a nice day.